Hey everybody, welcome back to the program. Today we're talking about the Beatles, but more specifically the songwriting partnership of John Lennon and Paul McCartney. I'm sure by now most of you already know that not everything they wrote was recorded by the Beatles, which only makes me wonder why, since 3 of their first 4 albums are full of cover songs. Why would they give away any of their songs to other artists to record when they clearly don't have enough material to fill their own albums? You would think the Beatles wouldn't want to give anything away, and yet they did. And so on today's video, we're going to try to understand why the Beatles gave away so many songs. But before we get into all of that, I just want to take a moment and ask you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It makes a big difference and I really appreciate it. Thank you to those who already have. All right, on with the video. So I guess the simplest explanation is that they wanted to give the songs away. You see, back when Lennon and McCartney first started writing songs together as teenagers, they decided to form a songwriting partnership like the famous duos before them, such as Rodgers and Hart, Lerner and Loewe, and Rodgers and Hammerstein. Paul said, "The only thing we knew about songwriting was that it was done by people like them. We'd heard these names and associated songwriting with them." So even from the very beginning, they wanted to be known as songwriters, which meant that one of the goals was to get other people to record their songs, because at that time, most of the famous songwriters didn't actually perform the music themselves. Of course, another goal was to record their own songs and be known as a band, but even then, their creative output was slow. By 1962, their live set largely consisted of songs written by other people. Even their January 1st, 1962 Decca Records audition tape reveals that of the 15 songs they recorded, only 3 were original compositions. And while Decca passed on the band, the 3 original songs did catch the attention of Ardmore and Beechwood Publishing, which in turn helped the Beatles to land an initial recording deal with EMI. Now, it's important to remember that back in the early 60s, it wasn't as common for a band to write their own music as it was later on in the 60s. As Paul described it, the music business network was made up of songwriters and groups. Normally, you would be offered a couple of songs by a publisher in cahoots with your producer. A lot of the time, this was a win-win situation, as groups just starting out would get a better shot at scoring a hit single written by an experienced writer. Sometimes you would see multiple groups record the same song, only for one of them to gain traction and become the definitive version. A prime example of this was the standard Unchained Melody. Originally written in 1955 for a film, the Righteous Brothers recorded their take on it 10 years later, and it became the version everyone knows. And so when it came time for the Beatles to record their first single for EMI, producer George Martin insisted the Beatles record a song written by someone else, but they were adamant on having their song Love Me Do as their first single. George Martin eventually relented, and while Love Me Do only peaked at the number 17 spot on its initial release, it proved to him that Lennon and McCartney were capable songwriters. It's also important to know that about a month before Love Me Do was released, John and Paul signed a separate songwriting management contract with Brian Epstein. This was in addition to his management duties for the Beatles. Brian saw this as another potentially lucrative revenue stream for the pair, and it made sense at the time to diversify their income, since songwriting can be seen as a longer-term occupation because bands could often end up being one-hit wonders. John said, "Unless something happens, there's nothing to stop Paul and I writing hits when we're old. It's so profitable." I think Brian also had his pocketbook in mind, as pretty much all of the other bands that ended up recording songs written by Lennon and McCartney were also managed by him. The first was Billy J. Kramer with the Dakotas and their recording of I'll Be On My Way. This was the B-side for their debut single, which was another Lennon and McCartney song, Do You Want to Know a Secret? The single was released in April and it sold incredibly well, eventually reaching number 1 or number 2 in the UK, depending on which chart you use. But it does make me wonder why I'll Be On My Way wasn't on the Beatles' debut album, Please Please Me, since out of the 14 tracks, 6 are cover songs. But this probably has to do with their producer George Martin originally wanting a live album, but found that the Cavern Club was not a suitable recording location, so it decided to record at EMI Studios. George asked the Beatles what they had which we could record quickly, and the answer was their stage act. I think it was really important to the Beatles and George to capture their live show, and their covers were a big part of it. The song I'll Be On My Way wasn't something that they played live, so it makes sense they wouldn't have it ready to record. Also, it was a song that Paul wrote in 1958, and they probably considered it a throwaway song and not something they felt was worthy of inclusion on their debut album. All in all, 1963 was an incredible year for the Beatles. They scored at least 3 #1 UK hit singles. Their first 2 albums went to the top of the UK charts. Lennon and McCartney also had 9 original compositions released by other artists, with 5 of the singles entering the UK top 20 charts, including Billy J. Kramer's first #1 hit with Bad to Me, and the Rolling Stones, who scored a #12 hit with their version of I Wanna Be Your Man. But what's interesting to me is that their second album with the Beatles also has 6 covers and 8 original songs, which is crazy to me. Why wouldn't they record versions of the songs they wrote and gave away, especially when they're already proven to be successful? I mean, apart from I Wanna Be Your Man and Tip of My Tongue, they didn't even attempt to record them. George Martin offers one possible explanation, in that their focus was on recording singles, and the songs that weren't issued as singles would be put on an album, which was how the second album was put together. At this time, singles were more important than albums because that's what most teenagers were buying, which was their target demographic. The fact that their albums were selling so well was a bonus. The Beatles themselves didn't really put that much thought into their albums early on. They were really just more of a collection of their songs. As George Martin said, the Beatles didn't get totally immersed in record production until later on when they stopped touring. Until then, they didn't have time. As much as 1963 was an incredible year for the Beatles, it was nothing compared to 1964. Not only did they experience success beyond measure, they were incredibly busy. As George put it, in 1964, we seemed to fit a week into every day. By the end of the year, they released 3 singles in the UK, an EP of non-album songs, 2 albums, a film, and performed over 150 concerts all over the world, including the US and Australia. In February, the Beatles scored their first #1 hit single in the US with I Wanna Hold Your Hand. This was followed by their first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show to an estimated 75 million viewers. On April 4th, they scored another US #1 hit single with Can't Buy Me Love, but even more impressively, they held the top 5 positions on the Billboard chart. On top of all of this, by the end of 1964, Lennon and McCartney had 7 of their songs recorded and released by other artists, with 6 charting within the top 20 on the UK charts, including a #1 hit single by Peter and Gordon with their take on A World Without Love. What's interesting is that while their third album, A Hard Day's Night, had all original tracks, the following album, Beatles for Sale, went back to the formula of 8 original and 6 cover songs. And I think the reason for this was time constraints. As I've already stated, 1964 was a busy year for the band. George Martin said they didn't have time. They would dash into the studio and put down their tracks and then leave all the work to us. It was easier with their schedule to record the songs they knew and had been playing on the road. As Paul said, it was our stage show with some new songs. I think the only reason A Hard Day's Night had all original songs on it was because EMI wanted it that way, as reported by Record Mirror. So for With the Beatles and Beatles for Sale, the covers are both a necessity since they had so little time to record the albums, but they were also part of their stage show, so it was easy to knock them out. And keep in mind that at this time, there wasn't an expectation to fill an album with all original material. So in a sense, the cover songs were a way to fill out the album's obligation of 14 tracks, but they were more than just filler to the Beatles. They loved these cover songs. They put a lot of intention in choosing them, and if I'm honest, they really make those songs their own. And I think in a sense, recording those songs was a way to give back to those artists that inspired their own music, either by giving them a bump in publishing revenue, or at the very least, shining a spotlight on them, hopefully with their influence exposing more people to that music. As George said, there are some incredible R&B records from America that I find most Americans have never heard of. After 1964, the number of songs they wrote for other bands or gave away fell off dramatically, only about 1 a year from 1965 through 1969. Paul McCartney wrote a few on his own and even gave one away using a pseudonym to see if he could score a hit without his name recognition, and it did pretty good, cracking the top 20 on the Billboard chart in 1966. But I think one of the main reasons they stopped giving away songs is that they had less and less time to write their own music, let alone for other bands. The Beatles had taken on a life of its own in a way that no one could have predicted. Early on, it made sense to diversify their income because there was more longevity as songwriters, but after a certain point, it just didn't make sense anymore. John said they had more time, or seemed to, for other people. We thought we had some to spare. And as their songwriting became more sophisticated in their later output, that took more time to craft. The majority of the songs they gave away are super simple, and they couldn't keep writing in that style even if they wanted to because audiences' taste in music had also evolved. Another reason they stopped giving away music was because they didn't need to anymore. By 1965, they were arguably the most influential band in the world, and so it wasn't necessary to get their name out there. I think it was more important to focus their creative energy towards things that would benefit the band versus the songwriting duo. There was also a push to move away from the more simplistic rock and roll inspired songs of their first 4 albums and incorporate music from different genres and styles, and you see this with Help, but especially with Rubber Soul. George Martin said, "By the time of Rubber Soul, they were ready for new musical directions. For the first time, we began to think of albums as art on their own, as complete entities." 2 important things happened in 1966. They decided to not make a film like they had for the past 2 years, and they moved away from recording 2 albums a year. This not only gave them more vacation time away from the band, but it gave them more time to focus on songwriting and honing their songs in the studio. This in turn led the band to pay more attention to crafting an album versus just recording a bunch of singles. Also, George Harrison started to blossom into a very capable songwriter in his own right, and so I think for all of these reasons is why you see far fewer covers in their later work. I also think that because of the fact that they decided to stop touring in 1966 gave them a sense of freedom in their songwriting. They could write anything without concerns of how they're going to play it live. And in fact, they got a taste of this with Revolver because they didn't perform any of those songs during their final tour as a band in '66. This freedom also fostered experimentation in the studio using innovative recording techniques, and they also played around with songwriting structure. If you look at A Day in the Life from Sgt. Pepper's, it's a song that is made up of smaller songs that maybe a few years ago they would have tried to turn those into simple songs to give away to another band, but now they could use those as a jumping off point and create a unique and interesting composition. And I think this reflects the sophistication of their songwriting and their move to more creative songwriting choices. And I think because they were in the studio with George Martin, Ringo, and George, they added a lot to the songs that would otherwise be a skeleton of a song in the hands of another group. In other words, even though John and Paul got the writing credit, you can't discredit the involvement of the other members in shaping the songs we know today. I mean, can you just imagine trying to give Tomorrow Never Knows to a band who's never heard it and just reading it off notation music? It's just not the same song without the contributions of everyone else that was in the studio. And it's important to remember that the Beatles never gave away songs that they didn't want to record themselves. There are a couple of exceptions to this, including I Wanna Be Your Man, which was written for Ringo to sing, but was also given to the Rolling Stones, and I Call Your Name, which supposedly John felt they could make a better version of than Billy J. Kramer's. Other than that though, you can only find demos or live versions of these songs, and very rarely do you find an official Beatles recording. Also keep in mind the songs they gave away were never going to be Beatles songs. They were either not good enough or not the right sound for the band, or maybe they were too similar to songs they already had. So the idea was instead of just letting these songs go unused, they might as well give them to another band and make some money from the publishing. And maybe once a single became a hit by another artist, they weren't interested in making their own version unless they felt they could do it better. And if I'm honest, most of the songs they gave away are not their best. I mean, they aren't bad, they are pretty simple, but even John knew this when he spoke of I Wanna Be Your Man. He said it was a throwaway, we weren't going to give him anything great, right? But there are a couple of singles that I wish I could hear a proper Beatles version of, including I'm in Love, Bad to Me, and A World Without Love. Lastly, things were moving so quickly in '63 and '64, and they were churning out so many songs that they probably didn't want to spend a lot of time working on stuff that was old. And it's hard to know for certain, but maybe some of the songs that they gave away to other artists were rejected by the rest of the band or by George Martin or by Brian Epstein. It's hard to know for sure. But to me, the incredible thing is the fact that so many artists scored hits with the music of Lennon and McCartney. This is a testament to their talent and songwriting chemistry. To not only write all those amazing Beatles songs, but still have enough left over for other artists is incredible. And their partnership sent shockwaves that influenced so many songwriting partnerships since, including some of their contemporaries like Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. And so I think in the end, the reason why they gave away so many songs was not only for the notoriety and the money, but it allowed them to write songs for voices other than their own, like songs that didn't make sense for them to sing. And I think that little spark planted this creative seed that led to the back half of the Beatles catalog that is so creative and interesting, and obviously their careers afterwards. but together there was just this magic thing that happened, and I'm so grateful for the music that we did get. All right, everybody, that will do it for today. I want to thank you all so much for watching. This video was stupid hard to make. I'm telling you, I think I rewrote this twice. I almost abandoned it at one point just because I just hit a brick wall so many times. I mean, trying to answer this question is so not easy. You can't just like Google it. I tried. But I'm sure even after doing all of this, there are things I might have missed or glossed over in terms of like the reasons why. And I'm curious to know what you have to say. Do you agree? Do you disagree? What sort of details maybe I missed? Leave a comment down below. Until then, thank you again so much for watching. I really appreciate it, but I especially want to thank my members over on Patreon. I'm your Vinyl Geek, and I'll catch you on the flip side.